The morning started like any other Tuesday at Kensington Palace. Princess Charlotte was attending her regular art class in the West Wing. Surrounded by her instructors and security personnel, the 9-year-old princess had been working on a watercolor painting of the palace gardens. Her small hands carefully guiding the brush across the paper. Her protection officer, Marcus Webb, stood near the doorway, scanning the corridors as he had done countless times before. Nobody expected what would happen next. At precisely 10:45, a black van pulled up to the service entrance of the palace grounds. The driver presented credentials that appeared legitimate, claiming to be delivering supplies for the upcoming royal event scheduled for the weekend. The security checkpoint guards examined the papers, cross-referenced the delivery schedule, and found everything in order. They waved the van through without a second thought. Inside the palace, Charlotte had just finished her painting when a man in a maintenance uniform appeared at the classroom door. He spoke briefly with one of the staff members, explaining that there was an urgent issue with the plumbing in the adjacent room that needed immediate attention. The instructor nodded, barely glancing up from helping another student. The man in the uniform walked further into the room, his eyes scanning until they landed on the young princess. Marcus Webb felt something was wrong before he could articulate why. Years of training had honed his instincts, and something about the maintenance worker's posture, the way he moved, the slight nervousness in his gestures, set off alarm bells in the officer's mind. He stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio, but the man was faster than anyone anticipated. In one swift motion, he grabbed Charlotte's arm and pulled her toward him. The princess let out a startled cry, dropping her paintbrush. The classroom erupted into chaos. Instructors screamed, students scattered, and Marcus lunged forward, but the man was already moving, dragging the princess toward a side exit that had been mysteriously propped open. The maintenance uniform was a disguise, and a clever one. The man had somehow obtained authentic-looking credentials and had studied the palace layout meticulously. He knew exactly which cameras had blind spots, which corridors were less monitored during the morning hours, and which exit would give him the clearest path to his escape vehicle. Charlotte struggled against his grip, her training in such situations momentarily forgotten in her panic. She tried to remember what her parents had taught her, what the security team had drilled into her during safety exercises, but fear clouded her thoughts. The man's hand was firm on her arm, not brutal, but insistent. Pulling her along at a pace that made her stumble, Marcus burst through the door seconds later. His radio already crackling with emergency codes, palace security erupted into action. Doors began locking automatically. Alarms started blaring, and armed guards converged on the area from multiple directions. But the kidnapper had planned well. He and Charlotte disappeared around a corner. Just as the first responding officers arrived, the black van was waiting exactly where it should be. Engine running, back doors open. The driver, his face obscured by a cap pulled low, kept his eyes on the side exit, his foot hovering over the accelerator. When the man emerged with Charlotte, the driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Charlotte was pushed into the back of the van, the man climbing in after her. The door slammed shut, and the van lurched forward, tires squealing against the cobblestone courtyard. The security checkpoint guards, now alerted to the situation, attempted to close the gates, but they were seconds too slow. The van crashed through the partially closed barrier. Metal scraping against metal, sparks flying. Marcus reached the courtyard just in time to see the van disappearing through the damaged gate. He sprinted toward the nearest security vehicle, a Range Rover used for perimeter patrols. Another officer, Sarah Chen, was already behind the wheel, having responded to the emergency call. Marcus jumped into the passenger seat, and they accelerated after the van before he had even closed his door. Inside the palace, the emergency response was immediate and massive. The Metropolitan Police were notified within seconds. MI5 was brought into the loop. The royal family's private security coordinator initiated protocols that had been designed for exactly this scenario, though everyone had prayed they would never be needed. Phone calls were made to the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister was informed before the van had even left palace grounds. Prince William and Catherine were attending separate engagements across London when they received the news. Both were immediately escorted to secure locations by their protection officers while arrangements were made to bring them together. The shock and terror that gripped them was unimaginable to anyone who wasn't a parent. Their daughter, their precious Charlotte, had been taken. The van raced through the streets of London, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. The driver clearly knew the city well, taking turns at high speed, cutting through narrow alleys, and using bus lanes to bypass congested areas. But Marcus and Sarah stayed close, their Range Rover's powerful engine keeping pace. Sarah's hands were steady on the wheel, her years of pursuit training evident in every controlled turn and acceleration. Marcus was on the radio constantly, coordinating with the growing number of police vehicles joining the chase. Helicopters were being scrambled. Roadblocks were being set up at key intersections. The entire apparatus of law enforcement was mobilizing, but they had to be careful. Charlotte was in that van, and any aggressive action that caused a crash could harm her. Inside the van, Charlotte sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her heart pounding. The man who had taken her sat across from her, breathing heavily. She could see his face clearly now, and something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. He wasn't as old as she had first thought, perhaps in his 30s. With dark hair and eyes that kept darting between her and the front of the van, he hadn't hurt her, she realized. He hadn't been rough beyond the initial grab, hadn't threatened her, hadn't even spoken to her. He just stared, his expression a mixture of determination and something else. Regret? Fear? Charlotte couldn't tell. The van took a sharp turn, and Charlotte slid across the floor. The man reached out to steady her, then pulled his hand back as if afraid to touch her again. In the front, the driver shouted something she couldn't quite hear over the roar of the engine and the screech of tires. Meanwhile, this information was flowing into the investigation at an unprecedented rate. Security footage from the palace was being analyzed frame by frame. The fake credentials used to enter the grounds were being traced. Intelligence agencies were running facial recognition on every camera that had captured the van or its occupants. Within minutes, analysts had identified the van's make, model, and approximate year, and then came the breakthrough that would shock everyone involved in the investigation. Facial recognition software matched the kidnapper's face to existing databases. The identity that came back sent ripples through the entire operation, from street-level officers to the highest echelons of the royal household. The man who had taken Princess Charlotte was identified as Thomas Parker Bowles, the son of Queen Consort Camilla. The revelation was so unexpected, so contrary to every assumption investigators had been making, that it took several minutes for anyone to accept it as accurate. The software was run again. Alternative angles were analyzed. But the conclusion remained the same. This wasn't a terrorist attack. It wasn't a foreign plot or a criminal enterprise seeking ransom. This was something far more complicated, something that reached into the heart of the royal family itself. Thomas Parker Bowles, a man who should have had no reason to target his stepniece, had somehow decided to kidnap Princess Charlotte in broad daylight from one of the most secure locations in the country. The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. Why would he do this? Was he acting alone, or as part of a larger conspiracy? What were his intentions? Where was he planning to go? And most urgently, what was his state of mind? Was Charlotte in immediate danger from someone who should have been family? The chase continued through the streets of London. The gap between hunter and hunted narrowing and widening as traffic patterns and the driver's skills played their parts. Every officer involved knew they were part of something unprecedented. Royal protection had been breached in the most direct and devastating way possible. A member of the royal family had been taken, and the person responsible was himself connected to royalty. Sarah maneuvered the range rover through a gap between a bus and a taxi, gaining several car lengths on the van. Marcus could see the van's back doors now, could imagine Charlotte behind them, scared and confused. He thought about his own daughter, about what it would feel like to know she was in danger, and his resolve hardened. They would get Charlotte back. Failure was not an option he was willing to consider. The van suddenly swerved left, taking an unexpected turn down a side street. Sarah followed without hesitation, but the narrow road forced her to slow down. Pedestrians scattered, people pressed themselves against shop windows, and someone's shopping bags went flying as the two vehicles roared past. The van was heading toward the Thames, toward the maze of streets near the river, where escape might be easier. Inside the van, the driver was shouting now, his voice raised in clear alarm. Thomas responded in a lower tone, his words lost in the noise of the chase. Charlotte watched this exchange, her analytical mind working despite her fear. These two men didn't seem to be in complete agreement. The driver seemed more panicked, more desperate, while Thomas appeared conflicted, as if he was having second thoughts about whatever plan they had made. Back at the palace, investigators were diving deep into Thomas Parker Bowles' recent history. His phone records, his financial transactions, his social media presence. Everything was being examined for clues about his motivation and his intended destination. His family members were being contacted, including his mother, Queen Consort Camilla, who was reportedly in complete shock at the news. The van crossed a bridge over the Thames, the wide river glittering in the late morning sun. Tourist boats floated below, their passengers unaware of the drama unfolding above them. The police helicopter arrived overhead, its cameras capturing every moment of the pursuit. The footage being monitored by dozens of officials in various command centers across the city. Marcus studied the traffic ahead, trying to anticipate the van's next move. The driver was skilled, but he was also becoming more erratic, taking risks that suggested desperation rather than confidence. That could work in their favor or against them. Desperate people made mistakes, but they also became unpredictable and potentially more dangerous. The pursuit was now entering its 15th minute, though to everyone involved it felt both longer and shorter than that. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing based on the intensity of each moment. Charlotte had been missing from the palace for nearly 20 minutes. Her parents had been informed and were being rushed to a central coordination point. The news media had gotten wind that something major was happening, though the specific details were still being kept from the public to avoid panic and to maintain tactical advantage. Thomas Parker Bowles looked at Charlotte again, and this time she met his eyes directly. For a moment, recognition flickered across both their faces. She had seen him at family gatherings, brief encounters where adults exchanged pleasantries and children were largely ignored. He had always seemed pleasant enough, quiet, unremarkable. What had changed? What had driven him to this desperate act? The van careened through the narrow streets south of the Thames, the driver's desperation becoming more evident with each turn. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the vehicle, his radio discipline maintaining communication with the growing number of units joining the pursuit. Police cars were converging from multiple directions, forming a loose net that was slowly tightening around the fleeing. Bandot Sarah Chen demonstrated why she was considered one of the best pursuit drivers in the Royal Protection Unit. She anticipated the van's movements, cutting angles on turns, maintaining optimal distance to keep visual contact, without crowding the suspect vehicle into making a catastrophic decision. Her calm voice occasionally cut through the radio chatter, providing precise location updates and tactical assessments. Inside the van, the atmosphere was deteriorating rapidly. The driver, identified through additional database searches as Marcus Holloway, a former driver for various wealthy clients in London, was shouting constantly now. His plan, whatever it had been, was clearly falling apart. Thomas sat with his head in his hands, no longer watching Charlotte, no longer watching anything. The princess noticed his body language, the defeated slump of his shoulders, the trembling of his hands. Charlotte's initial terror was giving way to a different emotion. She was still frightened, but her natural curiosity and intelligence were beginning to reassert themselves. She studied Thomas carefully, noting details. He wasn't armed as far as she could see. He wasn't threatening her. In fact, he seemed almost as scared as she was. This observation didn't make her feel entirely safe, but it changed the nature of her fear. The investigation back at various command centers was producing more information by the minute. Thomas Parker Bowles' financial records showed significant debts, gambling losses that had accumulated over the past 18 months. His business ventures had failed spectacularly, leaving him owing money to several creditors. But there was something else in the records, something that investigators found puzzling. Large payments had been made to him from an offshore account over the past 3 months, totaling nearly £200,000. Someone had paid Thomas substantial amounts of money, and the timing suggested these payments were connected to his current actions. But who and why? The offshore account's origins were being traced, but that process would take time. Intelligence analysts were building theories, considering possibilities. Was this an attempt to embarrass the royal family? Was it politically motivated? Was someone using Thomas as a pawn in a larger game? Queen consort Camilla was interviewed by senior police officials at Clarence's house. She was reportedly devastated and confused, insisting she had noticed nothing unusual about her son's behavior. She had known about his financial troubles, but believed he was managing them through legitimate means. The suggestion that he might have been recruited or manipulated by outside forces to kidnap Charlotte seemed impossible to her. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The van made a sudden turn into an industrial area near Deptford, where warehouses and manufacturing facilities stood in various states of use and abandonment. This was a calculated move, suggesting the driver had a specific destination in mind, rather than simply fleeing randomly. The police helicopter tracked the vehicle from above, its high-resolution cameras providing real-time footage to every unit involved in the operation. Marcus noticed the change in the chase's character immediately. They were no longer simply pursuing. They were being led. The van's driver knew where he was going, which meant there was a plan, a destination, possibly accomplices waiting. He communicated this observation to the tactical commander coordinating the response, and the decision was made to hold additional units back slightly, preventing the suspects from feeling completely cornered while preparing to surround. Whatever location they were heading toward, the van pulled into a large, seemingly abandoned warehouse, its rusted metal doors standing open as if expecting their arrival. The vehicle disappeared into the building's dark interior, leaving Marcus and Sarah facing a critical decision. Following directly into an unknown space could be a trap. Waiting could give the suspects time to harm Charlotte or escape through another exit. Sarah stopped the Range Rover 50 meters from the warehouse entrance, positioning the vehicle for optimal cover. Marcus was already on the radio, calling for immediate backup, requesting the building's blueprints if available, and coordinating with the helicopter for thermal imaging to determine how many people were inside the structure and where they were. Positioned armed response units arrived within 3 minutes. Trained specialists who moved with practiced efficiency. The warehouse was quickly surrounded, every possible exit covered. Negotiators were en route. The helicopter's thermal camera showed 3 heat signatures inside, 2 adults and 1 smaller form that had to be Charlotte. She appeared to be separated from the 2 men by approximately 10 meters, suggesting they had placed her in a different area of the building. The tactical commander, a veteran named Detective Chief Inspector Andrews, established a command post in an armored vehicle that had arrived with the armed response teams. He studied the thermal images, the building plans that had been pulled from city records, and the various factors at play. His priority was clear: get Princess Charlotte out safely. Everything else was secondary. Inside the warehouse, Charlotte found herself in a small office area, separated from Thomas and Marcus's hallway by a glass partition. She could see them arguing, their gestures animated, their voices raised, though she couldn't make out the words clearly. The driver was pointing at Thomas accusingly, his face red with anger or fear, or both. Thomas was shaking his head, his hands raised as if trying to calm the other man. Charlotte assessed her situation with a clarity that would have made her protection officers proud. The door to the office wasn't locked. She had tested it quietly while the 2 men were focused on their argument. The warehouse had windows high up near the roof, letting in streams of dusty sunlight. She could hear vehicles outside, lots of them, and knew that help had arrived. Her job now was to stay calm, stay aware, and be ready to act if an opportunity presented itself. The realization that she might need to save herself was both terrifying and empowering. Her parents and her security team had always told her she was smart and capable. Now she had a chance to prove it. She looked around the office, noting potential weapons or tools. A heavy stapler on the desk, a letter opener, a chair that could be wedged against the door if needed. She was 9 years old and facing a crisis that would challenge adults, but she refused to be helpless. Outside, DCI Andrews made the decision to attempt communication. A negotiator, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Marsh, approached the warehouse entrance with a portable speaker system. Her voice, calm and professional, echoed through the building. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Marsh with the Metropolitan Police. We know you're inside with Princess Charlotte. We want everyone to come out of this safely. We're willing to talk about your concerns, but we need you to show us that Charlotte is unharmed. Can you bring her to where we can see her?" Inside, both men froze at the sound of the voice. Marcus Holloway looked at Thomas with wild eyes, panic evident in his expression. Thomas, however, seemed almost relieved. He walked toward the office where Charlotte waited, and she tensed, preparing to defend herself if necessary. But he simply opened the door and spoke to her for the first time since taking her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This was a mistake. Terrible mistake." Charlotte stared at him, not responding, not trusting this sudden change. Thomas turned and walked toward the warehouse entrance, his hands rising above his head. Watched, confused, as he stepped into the light streaming through the open doors. The police response was immediate. Armed officers moved forward, weapons trained on Thomas, shouting commands. He complied with every order, dropping to his knees, placing his hands behind his head, lying flat on the ground. Within seconds, he was secured, handcuffed, and being moved away from the entrance. But Charlotte was still inside with Marcus Holloway, and he had not surrendered. The negotiator's voice called out again, this time specifically addressing the driver. There was no response. The thermal imaging showed that Holloway had moved closer to Charlotte's position, and that escalated the situation immediately. Marcus Webb, who had been waiting in controlled agony since arriving at the warehouse, felt his heart rate spike. The man who had helped kidnap Charlotte was now alone with her, cornered, probably desperate. This was when situations could become most dangerous. Desperate people did unpredictable things. Inside the office, Charlotte heard footsteps approaching. She grabbed the heavy stapler from the desk and positioned herself behind the door, her mind racing through her limited options. She was scared, but she was also determined. She thought about her mother, about her father, about her siblings, and about going home. She would not give up without fighting. Marcus Holloway appeared in the doorway, and he looked terrible. His face was drained of color, his hands were shaking, and his eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape routes that didn't exist. When he saw Charlotte holding the stapler in a defensive posture, something in his expression shifted. He looked at this small girl, preparing to defend herself against a grown man, and the reality of what he had become part of seemed to hit him fully. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice cracking. "I just needed the money. I have debts. Bad people were threatening my family. They said this would be easy, that we'd just take you for a few hours, that your family would pay and nobody would get hurt. I didn't think about you being scared. I didn't think about you being real." Charlotte didn't lower the stapler, but she listened. The man was clearly breaking down, the weight of his actions crushing him. She understood in that moment that he was not evil, but weak and foolish and trapped by his own bad decisions. That didn't make what he had done acceptable, but it made him less terrifying. "There are police everywhere," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You can't get away. But if you let me go now, if you walk out with your hands up like Thomas did, maybe it won't be as bad for you." Holloway laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "It's already as bad as it can be. I kidnapped a princess. My life is over no matter what happens now. Then at least end it by doing the right thing," Charlotte replied. "Let me walk out. Don't make it worse by hurting me." Outside, the negotiation team was preparing for multiple scenarios. SALT teams were positioning for a possible forced entry. Medical teams stood ready. Prince William and Catherine had arrived at the command post, held back from the immediate area, but close enough to respond the moment their daughter was safe. The tension was unbearable for everyone involved. Marcus Holloway stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, slowly, he stepped back, giving Charlotte a clear path to the door. "Go," he said. "Run." Charlotte didn't need to be told twice. She dropped the stapler and ran, her legs pumping, her breath coming in gasps. She burst out of the office area, saw the sunlight streaming through the warehouse entrance, and sprinted toward it. Behind her, she heard Holloway's voice calling out to the police, announcing his surrender. The moment Charlotte appeared in the warehouse entrance, multiple things happened simultaneously. Armed officers moved forward to secure her medical. Personnel rushed to assess her condition. And Marcus Webb broke through the perimeter controls to reach the girl he had sworn to protect. But Charlotte ran past the reaching hands, past the shouted questions, straight toward where she had spotted her parents. Prince William caught his daughter as she launched herself into his arms. Catherine's arms immediately wrapping around them both. The family held each other, tears flowing freely, words unnecessary. Charlotte was safe. The nightmare was over. Marcus Holloway walked out of the warehouse with his hands raised, and he too was secured, handcuffed, and taken into custody. 2 suspects apprehended, 1 princess recovered unharmed. By the most important measure, the operation was a complete success. But the questions remained. Why had Thomas Parker Bowles done this? Who had paid him? What was the intended outcome? And how had security been breached so thoroughly? These questions would need answers, and getting them would prove to be almost as complicated as the rescue itself. The interrogation rooms at New Scotland Yard were working at full capacity. Thomas Parker Bowles sat in one, Marcus Holloway in another, both under intense questioning by experienced detectives trained in extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. The 2 men had been separated immediately upon arrest, preventing them from coordinating their stories, and their interviews were being conducted simultaneously. To catch any discrepancies, Thomas appeared to have aged 10 years in the hours since his arrest. He sat slumped in the metal chair, his expensive clothes rumpled and stained, his hands occasionally rising to cover his face. The detective interviewing him, a sharp woman named Inspector Caroline Foster, studied him carefully before beginning her questions. "You understand the gravity of what you've done?" Forster asked, her tone neither harsh nor sympathetic, simply matter-of-fact. Thomas nodded without looking up. "I understand that I've destroyed my life and probably broken my mother's heart. I understand that I've terrified a child who never did anything to harm me. I understand all of it now, though I wish I had understood it before." "Then help me understand why. You're not a career criminal. You have no history of violence. Your background check shows parking tickets and a minor drug possession charge from university. It's nothing that predicts this kind of action. So what happened?" Thomas finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. The story he told over the next 2 hours painted a picture of a man drowning in debt, making increasingly desperate decisions and ultimately being manipulated by someone who knew exactly which pressure points to exploit. The gambling debts had started small, just friendly games with friends, and moved to online casinos, then to private games with higher stakes. Thomas had convinced himself he could win back his losses, a classic trap that had snared countless others before him. Within a year, he owed money to several dangerous organizations. It's the kind that didn't send polite reminder letters, but made threats that were very real. Then, 6 months ago, he had been approached by a man who called himself David Mitchell, though Thomas suspected that wasn't his real name. Mitchell claimed to represent a group of investors interested in embarrassing the British royal family for political reasons. He offered Thomas a solution to all his financial problems: participate in a kidnapping that would be brief, bloodless, and would result in no real harm to anyone involved. He made it sound almost noble, Thomas said, his voice hollow. He talked about how the royal family was a symbol of inequality, how they lived in luxury while ordinary people struggled. He said this would be a statement, a way to show they weren't untouchable. And he promised me enough money to clear my debts and start fresh somewhere else. "Did you believe him?" Foster asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to. Or maybe I just needed to believe someone could save me. I was getting phone calls at night threatening my mother, threatening my stepfather. They knew where I lived, where I went, who I cared about. Mitchell offered me a way out, and I took it because I was too weak and too scared to do anything else." The payments to Thomas's account had come in installments, each one timed to keep him committed to the plan. Mitchell had provided detailed information about palace security, schedules, and procedures that suggested inside knowledge or extensive surveillance. He had arranged for Marcus Holloway's involvement, promising the driver even more money than Thomas was receiving. The van had been stolen specifically for this purpose, its plates cloned from a legitimate delivery vehicle. The plan, as Mitchell had explained it, was simple. Take Charlotte, drive to a predetermined location, make a brief video statement about royal privilege and inequality. Then release her unharmed at a safe location where she could be easily found. The video would spread on social media before authorities could suppress it, generating global headlines and embarrassing the royal family. Thomas and Holloway would receive their final payments and disappear, possibly leaving the country entirely. But it didn't go that way, Foster observed. No, Thomas agreed. The moment I grabbed her arm, the moment I saw her face and realized she was just a scared child, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Every second after that was trying to figure out how to undo it without getting killed by the people I owed money to or arrested by the police. I chose arrest. In the other interrogation room, Marcus Holloway was telling a similar story with different details. He had been a successful driver for wealthy clients until a car accident had left him with injuries that prevented him from working for several months. Medical bills had piled up, his savings had evaporated, and his wife had left him, taking their daughter. When Mitchell approached him with an offer of quick money for what was described as a political statement, Holloway had convinced himself it was justified. I thought I was striking back at privilege, Holloway told his interrogator, Detective Sergeant James Wright. I thought I was doing something meaningful. But the moment we had her in the van, I realized I was just a criminal who had terrorized a child. There's no political justification for that. There's no excuse. Both men were asked repeatedly about Mitchell and his associates. They provided descriptions, but both admitted they had only ever met Mitchell in person twice. Always in public places like cafes or parks, where surveillance would be difficult. All other communication had been through encrypted messaging apps or disposable phone numbers. The money had come from offshore accounts that would be nearly impossible to trace. Without international cooperation in significant time, intelligence services were already working on identifying Mitchell, running the descriptions through databases, analyzing the communication patterns, and attempting to track the financial transfers. The sophistication of the operation suggested professional involvement, possibly from a foreign intelligence service or a well-funded activist organization with access to technical expertise and substantial resources. Meanwhile, at a private hospital in central London, Princess Charlotte was undergoing a thorough medical and psychological evaluation. Physically, she was completely unharmed. Not a bruise, not a scratch. But the psychological impact of being kidnapped was something that would require careful attention and ongoing support. The child psychologist assigned to her initial evaluation, Dr. Sarah Ahmed, was struck by Charlotte's composure. The princess answered questions clearly, described her experience with remarkable detail, and showed an analytical approach to processing what had happened to her that was unusual for her age. I was scared, Charlotte told Dr. Ahmed, but I also knew that lots of people would be looking for me. I knew my parents wouldn't stop until I was found, and I knew that Thomas and Marcus weren't really trying to hurt me. They were just desperate and stupid. That's a very mature way of looking at it, Dr. Ahmed observed. Charlotte shrugged. My parents always say we should try to understand why people do things, not just be angry at them. I'm angry, but I also feel sorry for them. They ruined their own lives. Prince William and Catherine stayed close to their daughter throughout the evaluation, a relief at her safety mixed with concern about any hidden trauma that might emerge later. They had been briefed on what had happened, on Thomas's involvement, and the apparent conspiracy behind the kidnapping. The betrayal by a family member, even one connected by marriage rather than blood, was devastating to process. Queen Consort Camilla requested a private meeting with William and Catherine, which took place in a secure room at the hospital. The meeting was tense and emotional, with Camilla struggling to find words adequate to express her horror and remorse over her son's actions. I don't expect forgiveness, Camilla said, tears streaming down her face. What Thomas did is unforgivable. But please know that I had no idea, no hint that he was planning anything like this. If I had known, I would have stopped him. I would have told you. I would have done anything to prevent it. Catherine, her arm protectively around Charlotte, who sat between her parents, nodded slowly. "We believe you, Camilla. This isn't your fault. Thomas made his own choices, terrible choices, and he'll face the consequences. But he's still your son, and we understand that this is devastating for you too." The conversation was difficult but necessary, beginning a process of healing that would take considerable time. The royal family, accustomed to presenting a united front to the world, was facing an internal crisis that threatened to create lasting divisions if not handled carefully. Back at Scotland Yard, investigators were piecing together the technical aspects of how the security breach had occurred. The credentials used to enter the palace had been sophisticated forgeries based on real documents, suggesting access to restricted information. The maintenance uniform had been an authentic one, possibly stolen or purchased from someone with legitimate access. The knowledge of palace layout and procedures had been detailed and accurate. This level of inside information pointed to several possibilities. Someone within the palace staff or security apparatus might have been compromised, willingly or unwillingly providing information. Alternatively, surveillance of the palace over an extended period might have yielded enough observational data to plan the kidnapping. A full security review was ordered. Every staff member with access to sensitive areas would be revetted. Numerous procedures would be updated to prevent similar breaches in the future. The media coverage of the kidnapping and rescue was intense and immediate. Within hours of Charlotte's recovery, news outlets around the world were running the story. The fact that Thomas Parker Bowles, Queen Consort Camilla's son, was involved added a sensational element that guaranteed saturation coverage. Speculation ran wild about motivations, conspiracies, and implications for the royal family. The royal communications team worked to manage the narrative, releasing carefully crafted statements that confirmed basic facts. While protecting sensitive details of the ongoing investigation, Prince William and Catherine released a brief video message, standing together outside the hospital, thanking everyone who had been involved in Charlotte's rescue and asking for privacy as their family recovered from the ordeal. Marcus Webb, protection officer who had pursued Charlotte and whose quick response had been crucial to the successful outcome, was quietly commended for his actions. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, but internally within the protection service, his handling of the crisis was studied and praised. Sarah Chen, his partner during the pursuit, received similar recognition. In the days following the kidnapping, as the initial shock began to fade and people started processing what had happened, several truths became clear. First, that no security system is perfect. Determined individuals with inside information could breach even the most protected environments. Second, that desperation could drive people to actions they would never otherwise consider. And that made them both unpredictable and potentially reachable through negotiation rather than force. And third, that the human element in security was both its weakest link and its greatest strength. Charlotte returned to Kensington Palace 3 days after her kidnapping, accompanied by her parents and an enhanced security detail. She walked through the same corridors where she had been taken, facing her fear directly rather than letting it control her. She even returned to the art classroom, picking up the paintbrush she had dropped during her abduction and finishing the watercolor of the palace gardens she had started. Her teachers and classmates welcomed her back with a mixture of relief and uncertainty about how to treat her after such an ordeal. Charlotte handled it with remarkable grace, thanking everyone for their concern, but making it clear she wanted to return to normal routines as much as possible. She didn't want to be defined by what had happened to her. She wanted to be Charlotte again, not just the princess who had been kidnapped. The investigation into Mitchell and his associates continued, becoming an international effort involving intelligence services from multiple countries. Tracking the money proved extremely difficult, routed through shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges designed to obscure origins and destinations. The encrypted communications were analyzed by technical experts, but the security protocols used were sophisticated enough to resist easy decryption. Weeks turned into months, and while some progress was made in understanding the network that had orchestrated the kidnapping, Mitchell himself remained unidentified and at large. The possibility that he was a false identity created specifically for this operation seemed increasingly likely. The political motivations he had described to Thomas were probably fabrications designed to make the crime seem more palatable to the reluctant participants. Thomas Parker Bowles and Marcus Holloway both pleaded guilty to kidnapping charges, avoiding trial. Their cooperation with investigators earned them some consideration, but the sentences they received reflected the severity of their crimes. Thomas was sentenced to 12 years in prison, Holloway to 10. Both men expressed remorse, but remorse could not undo what they had done. The impact on Thomas's family was profound and lasting. Camilla's relationship with other members of the royal family remained strained despite everyone's best efforts at reconciliation. She visited her son in prison but struggled with the knowledge that he had endangered a child she cared about. Thomas's sister, Laura Lopes, found herself caught between loyalty to her brother and horror at his actions, a position that caused her significant emotional distress. 6 months after the kidnapping, Princess Charlotte celebrated her 10th birthday with a private party at Windsor Castle. The event was deliberately kept low-key, attended only by immediate family and a few close friends. Security was predictably intense, but efforts were made to keep it as unobtrusive as possible. Charlotte had requested that people stop treating her differently. Stop acting like she might break at any moment. The young princess had been working with Dr. Ahmed regularly, processing the trauma of her experience in age-appropriate ways. The therapy sessions had revealed that while Charlotte had been frightened during the kidnapping, she had also felt a strange sense of control once she realized her captors weren't planning to harm her. That feeling of agency, of making decisions that contributed to her own rescue, had been psychologically protective. Many trauma survivors struggle with feelings of helplessness. Dr. Ahmed explained to William and Catherine during one of their parent consultation sessions. Charlotte experienced something different. Yes, she was a victim, but she also made choices that mattered. She observed her captors, assessed the situation, defended herself when necessary, and even talked Marcus Holloway down in the final moments. That active participation in her own survival is actually helping her process the experience. Still, there were signs of impact. Charlotte was more cautious now, more aware of her surroundings, more careful about trusting people she didn't know well. She sometimes had nightmares about being trapped in enclosed spaces. Loud noises made her jump. These were normal responses to trauma, and they were being addressed through therapy. But they were reminders that the kidnapping had changed her in ways, both visible and invisible. The investigation had continued throughout these months, expanding far beyond the initial arrests of Thomas and Holloway. The mysterious figure known as Mitchell had become something of an obsession for the lead investigators, particularly Detective Chief Inspector Andrews, who had coordinated the rescue operation. He felt personally invested in finding the man who had orchestrated the kidnapping, the puppet master who had manipulated desperate men into committing crimes he would never have contemplated on their own. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a financial analyst working for the National Crime Agency. Following money trails through international banking systems, noticed a pattern in seemingly unrelated transactions. The accounts used to pay Thomas and Holloway had also been connected to payments for surveillance equipment, technical services, and travel expenses for individuals who had been near Kensington Palace in the months before the kidnapping. By painstakingly connecting these dots, investigators were able to identify a physical location where coordination of the operation had taken place. The location was an office suite in Amsterdam, rented under a false company name, but linked through complicated financial chains to the same network that had funded the kidnapping. Dutch authorities raided the location, seizing computers, documents, and communications equipment. The analysis of this material would take months, but it represented the first solid lead on the organization behind the crime. What emerged from this analysis was both illuminating and disturbing. The kidnapping of Princess Charlotte had not been primarily about ransom or political statements. It had been a test, a proof of concept for a criminal organization that specialized in high-level security, breaches, and targeted operations against protected individuals. The group appeared to be international in scope, with connections to criminal networks in Eastern Europe, Asia, and South America. Their business model was sophisticated and terrifying. They would identify wealthy or prominent targets, study their security arrangements, plan operations to breach those arrangements, and then either execute kidnappings for ransom or sell their operational plans to other criminal groups. The British royal family had been chosen because successfully breaching their security would demonstrate the organization's capabilities to potential clients. Worldwide, this revelation changed the nature of the investigation entirely. It was no longer just about solving a single crime, but about dismantling an international criminal enterprise. Europol became involved, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. The operation, codenamed Broken Crown, grew to involve hundreds of investigators in a dozen countries. Meanwhile, the security review at Kensington Palace and other royal residences had resulted in sweeping changes. New protocols were implemented, additional screening procedures for all personnel were introduced, and technological upgrades to surveillance and access control systems were completed. Marcus Webb worked closely with security consultants to identify and address the vulnerabilities that had been exploited. During the kidnapping, the changes were necessary, but came with costs. The royal family, particularly the younger members, found their already restricted lives becoming even more controlled. Charlotte, who had previously been able to move somewhat freely within palace grounds, now had to have protection officers within sight at all times. The balance between security and normal childhood development became increasingly difficult to maintain. Prince William and Catherine struggled with these challenges, wanting to keep their children safe while also wanting them to grow up as normally as possible given their unique circumstances. They consulted with child development experts, with security professionals, with other royal families around the world who faced similar issues. There were no easy answers, only difficult compromises that never felt entirely satisfactory. In prison, Thomas Parker Bowles spent his days in a strange state of regret and reflection. He had cooperated fully with investigators, providing every detail he could remember about Mitchell and the organization he represented. He had written letters of apology to Charlotte, to his mother, to everyone affected by his actions, though he didn't expect any of them to be read or acknowledged. He participated in educational programs, worked in the prison library, and tried to find some path toward redemption that probably didn't exist. His mother visited him regularly. Despite the emotional difficulty of these encounters, Camilla had been devastated by her son's actions, and her position within the royal family had become awkward and painful. She had offered to step back from public duties, but King Charles had refused to allow it, insisting that she was not responsible for her adult son's decisions. Still, the warmth that had been developing between Camilla and the younger royals had frozen, replaced by polite distance that everyone pretended not to notice. Marcus Holloway's experience in prison was different. He had no family support, his wife having divorced him and obtained a restraining order, preventing contact with their daughter. He spent much of his time writing a detailed memoir of his life and the decisions that had led him to participate in the kidnapping. He hoped that somehow, someday, his daughter might read it and understand that he had been weak and foolish, but never cruel. That he had loved her even while making choices that destroyed any chance of being part of her life. The wider public's reaction to the kidnapping evolved over time. Initial shock and outrage gradually gave way to more nuanced discussions about security, about the pressures that drive people to desperate acts, about the vulnerability of even the most protected individuals. Conspiracy theories proliferated on social media, as they always do. But mainstream coverage remained focused on established facts rather than speculation. Charlotte's handling of her ordeal became something of a cultural touchstone. She was praised for her composure, her intelligence, her bravery. Some commentators worried that this praise placed unfair expectations on a child, that she was being turned into a symbol rather than being allowed to be a person. Others argued that acknowledging her strength was appropriate and empowering. The debate reflected larger societal conversations about childhood, trauma, and resilience. The investigation into the criminal organization made steady progress throughout the year following the kidnapping. Additional arrests were made in several countries. Financial assets were frozen. Encrypted communications were partially decrypted, revealing connections to other unsolved crimes against prominent individuals in various countries. The organization's network was larger and more sophisticated than initially believed, and dismantling it completely would take years of international cooperation. Mitchell, the man who had recruited Thomas and orchestrated the operation, was eventually identified through a combination of digital forensics and old-fashioned detective work. His real name was Viktor Kozlov, a former intelligence officer from a country that shall remain unnamed, who had transitioned into criminal enterprise after leaving government service. He was arrested in Singapore while attempting to arrange another operation, this time targeting the child of a technology billionaire. The arrest made international headlines and was considered a major victory for law enforcement. Kozlov was extradited to the United Kingdom to face charges related to Charlotte's kidnapping, among numerous other crimes. His trial would be lengthy and complex, involving evidence from multiple jurisdictions and testimony from dozens of witnesses. Thomas Parker Bowles would be among those witnesses, facing the man who had manipulated him into destroying his own life. For Charlotte, life gradually returned to a new version of normal. She continued her education, pursued her interests in art and sports, and maintained relationships with her siblings and friends. She was still a princess, still subject to protocols and security measures, still living a life that was fundamentally different from her peers. But she was also just Charlotte, a girl growing up, learning, making mistakes, and discovering who she was beyond her titles and circumstances. On the first anniversary of her kidnapping, Charlotte asked to visit the warehouse where she had been held. Her parents were initially reluctant, but Dr. Ahmed supported the idea, believing it could be therapeutically beneficial to confront the location from a position of safety and control rather than leaving it as a place of fear in her memory. The visit was arranged with typical security precautions. Charlotte walked through the abandoned building, now empty and quiet, accompanied by her parents and her protection officers. She stood in the office where she had held the stapler, preparing to defend herself, and she remembered the fear but also the determination she had felt. She saw the space where Marcus Holloway had stood before, deciding to let her go, where a man's conscience had overcome his desperation. "I thought this place would be scarier," Charlotte said, looking around the dusty office. "But it's just a building." The scary part was not knowing what would happen. Now I know what happened. I survived. I'm okay. Prince William knelt beside his daughter, his eyes glistening. "You're more than okay. You're extraordinary." Charlotte shook her head. "I'm just me. That's all I want to be." They left the warehouse behind, returning to their vehicles and their lives. The building would eventually be demolished to make way for new development, erasing the physical location of Charlotte's ordeal, if not the memory of it. But Charlotte had already done the most important work of processing and moving beyond her trauma. The kidnapping had happened. It had been frightening, and it had changed her, but it would not define her. Marcus Webb, watching the princess walk confidently back to the security convoy, felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected to find. He had blamed himself for allowing Charlotte to be taken, had replayed those crucial seconds over and over in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. Seeing her now, strong and resilient, helped ease that burden of guilt. She had survived not just the kidnapping but the aftermath, and she would continue to grow and thrive. The investigation into the criminal organization continued, uncovering new connections and leading to additional arrests as months stretched into years. The group had been disrupted but not entirely destroyed, and law enforcement remained vigilant for signs of its reconstitution under new leadership. The world of high-end security would never be quite the same, forever changed by the demonstration that even royal protection could be breached by determined and well-resourced criminals. Thomas Parker Bowles served his sentence, working toward whatever redemption might be possible for someone who had committed such a crime. He would eventually be released, years in the future, to a world that would never forget what he had done. His relationship with his mother remained complicated and painful. His hope for forgiveness from Charlotte or her parents remained unrealistic. But he worked toward becoming someone who might deserve forgiveness, even if it would never be granted. The royal family moved forward, as royal families must, balancing tradition with adaptation, security with accessibility, private trauma with public duty. King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla continued their work, the shadow of Thomas's crime gradually fading, if never entirely disappearing. Prince William and Catherine raised their children as normally as possible within extraordinary circumstances, forever grateful that Charlotte had come home safe and determined to ensure such a thing never happened again. and Charlotte herself grew up, the kidnapping becoming one chapter in her life story rather than the defining event. She would carry it with her always, the memory of fear and courage, of betrayal and rescue, discovering her own strength in the worst possible circumstances. But she would also carry forward her artistic talents, her curiosity about the world, her compassion for others, and her determination to be more than just a victim of a crime that happened when she was 9 years old. The story of the kidnapping became part of royal history, studied by security professionals, discussed by commentators, and gradually fading into the background as new events and new challenges emerged. But for those directly involved, it remained vivid and immediate, a reminder of how quickly life could change, how vulnerable even the most protected could be, and how resilience and courage could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Years later, when Charlotte was asked about the kidnapping during a rare interview upon reaching adulthood, she would provide a thoughtful response that reflected the wisdom gained from her experience and the years of processing that followed. "It was terrifying, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone," she said. "But it also taught me things about myself that I might never have learned otherwise. I learned that I was stronger than I thought. I learned that even people who do terrible things are still people, complicated and capable of change. And I learned that being rescued is wonderful, but being able to contribute to your own rescue is empowering in ways that last long after the danger has passed." The interviewer asked if she had forgiven Thomas Parker Bowles for what he had done. Charlotte considered the question carefully before answering. "Forgiveness is complicated. What he did was wrong, and the consequences of his actions rippled out to hurt many people beyond just me. But I also understand that he was desperate and manipulated, that he made terrible choices, but not from a place of evil. I hope he's found some peace with himself, and I hope he's used his time to become someone better than he was. That's the most I can offer, and maybe that's enough." It was a remarkably mature response from someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly in some ways, while maintaining her youth in others. Charlotte had integrated her experience rather than being consumed by it, and that integration allowed her to move forward with wisdom rather than bitterness. The final chapter of the story, if stories ever truly have final chapters, came when Viktor Kozlov was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in organizing the kidnapping and numerous other crimes. Justice had been served, as much as justice can ever be served in imperfect systems dealing with complicated situations. The criminal organization he had led was scattered, its members arrested or driven underground, its operations disrupted. But everyone involved knew that the victory was incomplete and temporary. Criminal enterprises evolved and adapted. New threats would emerge. Security would always be a challenge, balancing protection with freedom. The kidnapping of Princess Charlotte would serve as a cautionary tale and a case study. But it would not be the last time someone attempted to breach royal security or target protected individuals. What endured beyond the headlines and the investigations and the legal proceedings was the human story at the center of it all. A young girl had been taken, had been frightened, had found courage, and had come home safely. Families had been torn apart and struggled to heal. Institutions had been forced to examine their vulnerabilities and adapt. And everyone involved had learned something about fear, courage, desperation, redemption, and the complicated nature of justice in a complicated world. Princess Charlotte continued her life, carried forward by the love of her family, the dedication of those who protected her, and her own remarkable resilience. The kidnapping was part of her story, but it was not the whole story. She was writing the rest of it herself, one day at a time, choosing to be defined not by what had been done to her, but by how she chose to respond and who she decided to become. And in that choice, in that determination to be more than a victim, lay perhaps the most important lesson of all.